Last time we were discussing how where we are at in life impacts both what we have to offer as well as what we need in a mentoring relationship. But we also discussed several suggestions as to what types of functions can accomplish this. But it's really hard to overestimate the incredible impact organizational culture can have on mentoring relationship. Often our good intentions are thwarted by the forces outside of our control that are working against these very authentic types of relationships that we want to develop. So in the next couple episodes, I want to spend some time on this very important topic.
Welcome to Leadership Matters with Dr. Phil. His podcast discusses matters of leadership that really matter. Phil has had the privilege of mentoring leaders and coaching ministry teams around the world for several decades, and he's really looking forward to sharing with you some of the principles that have been so helpful for others. Leadership is about serving others, not power or position. Regardless of our context, family, job, ministry, or any circle of influence, we all have the potential to be this kind of leader. A foundational leadership skill that is often overlooked is mentoring intelligence. This series is based on the materials Phil has developed over a lifetime and taught in a variety of cultural contexts. To access all of our podcasts as well as our bonus leadership resources, just click the links in the description below or go to icmcanada.org/leadership matters or icmcanada.org/mentoring-intelligence. So now, let's join Phil as he discusses some leadership matters.
The culture of the organization or ministry determines the level and intensity of the mentoring relationships. For example, hierarchical structures inhibit mentoring relationships, while empowering, releasing models of ministry encourage them. This is why we discussed Jesus' model of leadership in previous episodes. What the leadership of the organization values, the type of it will be, what they value will be valued then by the whole group. Are people encouraged and given permission to mentor others? Who holds the power? And is it shared by just a few or by most? Is there open communication? Is that encouraged? Particularly across levels, different levels of leadership. These are all issues of organizational culture and what we want to talk about in this episode. Just to clarify, culture can simply be defined as just the way we do things around here. That's culture. This is just how we do things. Now, if we recognize it or not, we're all influenced by culture. Not only our ethnic culture in our countries, but also within our organizations. Some of these influences are neither good nor bad. It's just kind of the way it is. When I was in China a few years ago, I asked them, hey, why do you guys use chopsticks, not forks and spoons? Of course, they looked at me like I was crazy, and it wasn't the first time. But after they got over that, it became clear that they really had no idea. It was just the way they always did things around there. That's culture. And it influences us even if we're not aware of it. Even if we don't know how it developed, we're impacted by it. Now, of course, there's ethnic culture, but there's also organizational culture. Each organization, from a business to a church, is impacted by the culture that has been developed within that organization. All culture is based on certain values, and these actually change over time. However, what often happens in organizations is this. As the values change, there becomes a competition and sometimes an open war between the existing culture and the change that needs to happen in order to realign the organization's actions with its values. A leader who underestimates the power of culture, the way we do things around here, does so to their own peril and often results in their eventual unemployment. Within some church circles, often due to faulty theology, or organizational structures, have kind of gotten a bad name. We think that since the Church of Christ is an organism, not a man-made organization, culture will or really should not affect us. As God's character, the gospel should never change, right? God says, I'm the same, I change not. But when this divine mystery that the Apostle Paul writes about, Christ with his church, when that interfaces with our humanity on this earth, it's inevitable that some structure or organization will need to be developed. We see the early church struggling with this to some degree. Also, as they had to come up with ways to function, in areas that there was no real direct teaching from Jesus on. So the early apostles had to come up with some way of doing ministry, of structuring the early church. So it becomes an issue of how are our values then going to be reflected in our culture, in the way we do things around here. This is why we have spent quite a bit of time in this series discussing values regarding leadership. For it is these values that establish the culture of any group of people seeking to achieve a common purpose. Our values will impact, then, our mentoring relationships. Now, before you think I'm getting too far out in the weeds here, let's look at Matthew 9:17. Here Jesus uses the analogy of wineskins. He states what was obvious to his listeners, but might be missed by some of us who are used to seeing wine in bottles. He says that if you put new wine in old dried up wineskins, as the wine then ferments and expands, the brittle wineskins will burst, right? And they won't hold the wine. It'll spill to the ground, as Jesus said. He seems to indicate that it was not a problem of the new wine, right? It was a structural problem. It was a wineskin problem. We have to get our heads around the difference between the new wine in the church, which is divine and never changes, right? The gospel, with the structures or culture necessary in the human expression of the church that needs to adapt in order to be an appropriate vessel for this new wine. The church has been ordained by God as the vehicle of this new wine. But since it's made up of us rather mortal humans, it also has the attributes of any human organization made up of groups of individuals. Of course, at its very essence, it is the invisible, mystical community of God's people. Yet this community is expressed in human-made forms, which can be described, as we've done here, as wineskins. But these are not sacred in and of themselves, these wineskins, which is why they need to be regularly evaluated as to their usefulness in achieving the unchanging purposes of the church. Now the problem becomes when we ascribe to the structure, the wineskins, the same unchanging nature as the gospel or the body of Christ, this new wine. Local church structures vary over the centuries and they vary from culture to culture. This is why the details of how we do church vary over the decades and vary by country and vary by denomination. But ministry structures should always serve to fulfill the ultimate purpose of the community of God's people, the church. It is therefore possible to modify the structures without damaging or invalidating the very essence of the church or God's people. Now, in order for the leader of a local church, a fellowship, or a denomination to prepare the next generation of leaders and release them, in the body must fulfill its calling. They need to understand the dynamics at work within a group of individuals and how these result in organizational structures that either facilitate growth or hinder growth. This is why it is so important to consider what aspects of our organizational cultures may be working against the development of the very mentoring relationships we want to foster in our church. Trying to fit the new wine of mentoring within inflexible structures that work counter to these types of relationships always results in the new wine being spilt on the ground.
Listeners of our Leadership Matters podcast have exclusive access to our free bonus leadership materials, which include our MQ assessments as well as his Developing Others workshop. Just click the link in the description or go to our website icmcanada.org/mentoring-intelligence. If you would like to take a deeper dive into this topic, click on the link in the description box where you can download Phil's Mentoring Intelligence book and the workbook. In it, he discusses the key factors that affect our mentoring intelligence and then offers a practical mentoring model which leaders have been using for decades around the world. The Mentoring Through Intentional Relationship Guides are a practical model to actually help you mentor someone. They are available in several languages and over the years have been used by thousands of leaders. The content, discussion questions, and other tools are designed to assist you in mentoring a potential leader and are available at icmcanada.org/resources.
You know, in the organizational development field, there's a saying that culture will eat vision for lunch every day of the week. In Jesus' words, the condition of the wineskin is as important as the wine when it comes to fulfilling the organization's purpose. Leaders seldom want to admit it, but the reality is that the culture of a group is more influential than even the leadership's new vision or intentions of change. You know, this is why we need to make changes at a values level. As to what biblical leadership really looks like. That's pretty fundamental. Only then will our structures or cultures be conducive to the mentoring type of relationships that we want to build within our organizations. The culture of the organization or ministry determines if mentoring relationships are encouraged or discouraged. See, the reality is that a hierarchical culture inhibits these relationships, while an empowering, releasing culture will encourage mentoring relationships. Are people being encouraged and given permission in the organization to pursue these types of relationships? Other questions we need to consider are these: who holds the power? Is it shared by many or a few? Is there open communication encouraged across various levels of leadership? These will all impact the culture. So the culture of a group is often outside of our control, but nevertheless it has a crucial impact on our ability to form mentoring relationships. In order to be effective mentors, we need to understand the dynamics of the context within which mentoring relationships must function. The reality is that one of the main functions of leadership is to create the conditions within our organizations that encourage these types of relationships. This begins with the personal values of the leaders and the leadership team, as well as the culture and organizational structure of the ministries within which we serve. Within our shared human experience, we're dependent upon the relational structures that are necessary for individuals to interact and accomplish common goals. So to prepare the next generation of leaders and release them to fulfill their calling, leaders need to understand the dynamics at work within the groups of individuals and how these result in organizational structures that either facilitate or hinder mentoring. As mentioned, this component is often overlooked in leadership training and in the topic of mentoring. Usually within the first few years of ministry, young leaders often become frustrated as they keep hitting their heads against structural limitations that they don't really fully understand. Over the years of teaching on this subject, I've discovered something. When I began teaching on this subject after my initial seminar, I would leave and come back through a follow-up seminar. Invariably, I would discover a bunch of frustrated young leaders. They would say things to me like, I went back to my church, Phil, and shared with my pastor about mentoring, and I wanted, a mentor or to be a mentor, but the leadership either just ignored me or completely shut me down. Well, what was going on here? Well, my young friends were coming up against a structure and a culture that was based on values that were actually working against the empowering, releasing types of mentoring relationships that I had been talking about. They didn't have a chance. Remember, culture eats vision for lunch every day. If you missed the last episode, you might want to take a listen to catch up on some of the foundations on culture that I laid there. But I believe this is the key reason for the failure of mentoring relationships in so many churches and organizations. Remember, organizations are just groups of people organized around a common purpose or vision. But so often the values, which are usually unspoken, are working contrary to these types of relationships. If leaders feel threatened or are codependent or focused on gathering followers or yes men, it's very unlikely that mentoring and releasing others will be a high priority. These values actually will stifle mentoring relationships. So the culture of the church or Christian organization then is based on certain values and activities that the group thinks are important. More specifically, The culture of a group is a sum of the basic assumptions that are shared by the whole group. These assumptions are learned by the group as they adapt to the needs around them. The actions which turn out to be effective in meeting these needs are then seen as valuable, and they're taught to new members. This is how new members then learn to correct way to perceive, to think, to feel in relation to the challenges which then faces a group, and then this gets replicated usually generation after generation. Leaders who are not conscious of the culture in which they are embedded will be controlled by that culture rather than learning how to manage that culture. Understanding these dynamics can help the leader understand what is happening and what values are motivating the behavior of the members. As with other organizations, the culture of a church is also based upon the values, the beliefs, the assumptions of the pastor, his leadership team, and its members. I've discovered that whatever country I'm in, this dynamic is pretty consistent. As I mentioned previously, my young friends really didn't have a chance. Values and resulting culture needed to change. As we saw with King Saul, he had developed a culture in the palace that made it okay to throw spears at his protege. I wish I could report that this no longer happens, but you and I know that unfortunately it does. In our next episode, I'll provide some insights into what young leaders can do, who cannot find a mentor, who find themselves in unhealthy, life-killing organizations. And as always, I hope you'll be able to join me at the time. But before then, I'd like to leave you a few leadership matters to consider. What have you learned about culture from this episode? And how will this help you in developing your own mentoring relationships? Do your actions reflect kingdom leadership values? Or is there a disconnect between what you believe and how you exercise leadership in your family or organization? Reflect on the culture of the group you're part of as a member or as a leader. How does it encourage or discourage mentoring relationships? Are new wineskins needed?
Thank you for listening to Leadership Matters. If this has been helpful, please remember to like, subscribe, and share us. Doing this will enable others to benefit from this material as well. If you would like to partner with us to provide these materials to leaders who cannot afford them, please go to icmcanada.org/donation.